We'll turn in our study of Job at this time to the theological context. As we've noticed earlier, the fundamental test that comes forth in the book of Job is this: does Job, or will Job, be willing to revere God without the hope of personal gain? This attitude is known as disinterested piety, that is, being devoted to God even though there may not be a particular reward soon forthcoming. On the other hand, will it turn out that the piety expressed by Job is fundamentally self-serving? He serves God because it actually is gain for himself. To put this test in other words, why should one try to please God? Elihu will focus on this in chapter 34, verse 39, and again in 35:3. Keep in mind, Elihu is the last of Job's acquaintances, not part of the inner three, but the last one to speak. And he recaps Job's general position when he says in 34:9, "It profits a man nothing when he tries to please God." When a person is pious, trying to please God, it doesn't bring me any benefit. This would represent the fundamental contention of Job. And in 35:3, Elihu says of Job, "Yet you ask him," that is, ask God, "what profit is it to me? And what do I gain by not sinning? Why bother being a righteous person?" In other words, what's the advantage? This puts before us the fundamental test. If we wish to see a summary of retribution, on the other hand, that is retributive justice, that good things happen to people who do good and vice versa, here is one of several places where that basic understanding of conventional wisdom is presented. In this particular instance, Eliphaz is the speaker, and he says, "As I have observed," and observed is capitalized or italicized because it points out that the sage is presenting information gained by observation, a fundamental source of authority or truth for the sage. "As I have observed, those who plow evil, those who sow trouble, will reap it. At the breath of God they are destroyed." For such a massive book, it may be helpful to endeavor to compress the fundamental message of at least the three friends, these characters. And this compression, the summary for this, I'm largely indebted to David Klein's in his commentary. So he points that the basic message of Eliphaz is this: Job, you are a pious person, and eventually this will buoy you up. You will bob up on the far side of this tidal wave and come out successful because you're a good person. You're pious underneath it all. Bildad, particularly in chapter 8, has an encouraging word, but it's mixed. He says, "You don't need to fear, Job, because after all you're more righteous than your children. Now they perished because they must have been unrighteous, but you're in better condition than they as far as your rectitude, and so you don't need to fear." That's a mixed comfort, isn't it? Zophar takes this approach. Job, you need to realize that whether you know it or not, you are a sinner. Your guilt is worse than you realize, so you ought to come to the point of confessing, acknowledge sin, and then move on into forgiveness and restoration and eventual prosperity once again. Let's offer the same summary for Elihu. He will say that when we suffer, God is getting our attention, and it will lead us hopefully to admission of wrongdoing that will then bring us into restoration. But if we persist in doing wrong and resisting an opportunity for confession and restoration, then God will shatter us, the wicked. Elihu is also anxious to point out that God has a range of knowledge that far exceeds the human limits of wisdom. And if we were to summarize Job's position, we might state very pointedly at the outset Job's contention, I am innocent. I am not guilty. These misfortunes are befalling me undeserved. And then, as far as God, why is he not doing anything? Why is he silent? Oh, how I wish that I knew where to find him, to sit down and to reason this out, to understand better what's going on, and to present my case before him. I wonder, if you were God and you had been listening to Job, looking for you, accusing you, complaining, wishing for death through these various chapters, and also listening to these various so-called friends, what would you respond to Job? Would you perhaps apologize to Job? Or would you put your arm around him and comfort him? Would you say, well, let me pull the curtains aside and show you what's been going on in the heavenlies between me and Satan? Or perhaps you have some other response you would give. Consider it a moment and then continue on with the lecture as we probe to see exactly how God did respond. David Kleins explains God's response in these two ways. He observes first that God talks about elements of the universe, the cosmos, which are beyond humans' control. And then he points out particular animals which humans can't control and are not necessary for human existence. They're not domesticated. It's not like cattle or sheep or goats that provide milk or meat, this kind of thing. So between the marvels of the cosmos and animals that humans don't need and can't control, Kleins deduces from this that God has purposes known only to himself. He does some things that humans don't understand. He has his own purposes. And so, point number 2 from Professor Kleins, innocent suffering, like Job has been undergoing, is like one of these large animals that are not needed and not controlled by humans, a hippopotamus, as he calls it. Innocent suffering is a hippopotamus. It doesn't make sense to humans why God would bother making a hippopotamus, but he has reasons. And in parallel, it doesn't make sense to humans why he should allow innocent suffering, but it makes sense to God. So humans should trust God, who has greater knowledge over these things. Let me add to this, or perhaps come in dialogue with the viewpoints of others, and offer what seems to make sense to me concerning how God's response in chapters 38 and following provide an answer to this large issue of innocent suffering. First of all, God presents himself as supremely wise. God knows things that Job does not know, and that is certainly true for his knowledge of the cosmos. Secondly, God is supremely powerful, and this has to do with his ability to control the behemoth, the mighty animals which humans cannot control. And let's look particularly at the comment in chapter 40, verses 9 and following. So here we see Job 40, 9 and following. What we're watching for is, what can God's power produce? Is it just raw power, or does it have a focus? So he asks Job, do you have an arm like God's? Can your voice thunder like his? If so, is the implication, then adorn yourself with glory and splendor and clothe yourself with honor and majesty. Now the implication clearly is Job cannot. He cannot compare to God in terms of brute strength. And now notice where this strength is aimed. It's not raw power, but it has a focus. Verse 11, unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at every proud man and bring him low. Implication, if you have so much power, Job, then can you reduce the arrogant and bring them to justice? Verse 12, look at every proud man and humble him. Crush the wicked where they stand. Clearly, God is saying that his power is exercised to sustain justice. His power is exercised to sustain justice. This is fundamental, for it it responds to the basic contention of Job, wondering whether God is a just God. If so, why are these things happening to me? And God says, point one, I know some things you don't know about the stars and constellations. I know some things that you don't know. And point number two, I have power, and my power has a purpose. It is to bring about justice and righteousness. Let's go ahead and read verses 13 and 14 here, continuing in chapter 40. Bury them, that is the offending, arrogant, wicked people. Bury them all in the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. That is, show to me that you can exercise power over the arrogant wicked. Verse 14, then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. God says, if you have that much power to assure justice across the universe, then I'll tell you you're doing a great job, and you can take care of yourself. Now, clearly, Job cannot do this, and so he needs God to be the one who brings about justice, and God says that he's committed to doing so. So once again, God is supremely wise. He knows things that Job does not know. Right away, we can see that this is true from the prologue. God is aware of this test, this wager between himself and Satan. Job does not possess that knowledge. God knows things that Job does not know, and that has enormous impact over what Job is going through, and it converts unjust suffering into a wager where Job is God's hero, in a sense, his human hero, and he is Exhibit A to say to the defiance of Satan, there are people who love and serve me even when they seem to be getting nothing for doing so. Disinterested piety. And then point number two, God is not impotent. God is strong. He is all-powerful. And his power has the focus not just of raw force, but to assure that justice and righteousness do carry the day. I'd like to lift out one rhetorical question from chapter 22, which may, in the larger scope of the book, actually not be rhetorical. At one point, Eliphaz poses this question: can a man be of benefit to God? Can a man be of benefit to God? Now, on the initial plane, no, people are not needed by God. He does not depend on them. He's far above them. We are small, he is great. We are finite, he's infinite. But then, as our minds go to the prologue, we find that Job can benefit God if he will prove to be devoted to God even when there's no immediate payout. In this way, man can be of benefit to God in the cosmic tug of war, in the cosmic wager, rather, with God and Satan. Something to consider. Let's turn now to the conventional wisdom versus the theodicy question. Conventional wisdom starts with premise A, sinning yields suffering. Observation B, Job is suffering, therefore the conclusion, Job must have been sinning. We find God, however, revising this customary way of thinking. He'll affirm, yes, innocence does yield prosperity. B, Job is innocent, which leads us to step C, the paradox that Job is suffering. And now notice how this should be continued. Statement D, far beyond Job's earthly viewpoint, his limited knowledge, we find that God, part one, God knows reasons why suffering is taking place. God knows things that Job does not know. He has superior knowledge, superior wisdom. And secondly, God controls when it will be that retribution once again will be restored. So God's superior knowledge and his control over justice will one day restore retribution and not leave it to be suspended indefinitely. There is an Orthodox prayer that reads like this: teach me to treat all that comes to me with peace of soul and with the firm conviction that your will governs all. A worthy prayer for us to internalize and own for ourselves. Perhaps you've heard of the Catholic writer Brennan Manning, and I paraphrase something I came across recently as a question that Brennan Manning, in his understanding, anticipates that Jesus will focus on when we meet him in heaven, asking us simply this: did you truly believe that I loved you? I hope you found benefit in this study of a very, very important biblical book, and just a very precious contribution to the sacred collection, wrestling and giving perspective to unjust suffering.